Imagine building one of the greatest fortunes in history, only to see it vanish within a few generations. This is the story of the Vanderbilts, a dynasty born from steam, driven by steel, and ultimately consumed by its own grandeur. From ferry boats on the Hudson River to towering Gilded Age mansions, from ruthless rate wars to masquerade balls that made front-page news, the Vanderbilt legacy is as American as ambition itself. But behind the gold-plated ceilings and Italian marble, there were scandals, rivalries, heartbreaks, and whispers of a family curse. So how did a family that once controlled vast stretches of the U.S. economy end up with no billionaires among them today? Stay with us as we journey through 19th century hustle, 20th century splendor, and 21st century reflections in the rise and fall of the Vanderbilt dynasty. Imagining you are standing on the bustling docks of early 19th century New York, where the salty wind stings your cheeks, the shouts of dock workers echo through the air, and wooden ships creak as they bob on choppy waters. The city is nowhere near as tall or sprawling as it is today, but there's a palpable energy, something in the atmosphere that practically buzzes with the possibility of making it big. In this scene, you'll find a teenage boy from Staten Island steering his small ferry boat with unwavering determination, his eyes already scanning the horizon for the next big opportunity. That boy, born in 1794 to a humble family, will one day become known as Commodore, a moniker that symbolizes both his maritime conquests and his unyielding ambition. His name is Cornelius Vanderbilt, and his story, along with the grand legacy of the entire Vanderbilt family, remains one of the most enthralling examples of American self-made success. So let's rewind to Staten Island, New York, in the late 1700s. Cornelius Vanderbilt arrived in the world to a household that could best be described as modest. His father, often reported in historical accounts, including some references in the New York Times archives and local Staten Island historical blogs, as a farmer and boatman, worked tirelessly to make ends meet, exposing Cornelius to the gritty reality of survival in a place where money was often scarce. While many young people of the time might have been tempted to settle into a predictable life of manual labor, Cornelius had bigger ideas swirling in his head. He lacked a formal education, which might sound like an insurmountable obstacle to success in our modern world. But in that era, cunning, grit, and a willingness to take risks often mattered more than classroom learning. By 16, brimming with confidence and the kind of audacity that might have seemed almost absurd to his peers, he managed to borrow $100 from his mother, a large sum in the early 1800s, especially for a family with limited savings. With that money, he launched his own ferry service, transporting people between Staten Island and Manhattan. It was hardly glamorous work, just one small boat making its daily crossings. But as multiple newspaper archives and local historian blogs have pointed out, ferry routes were extremely important back then. They were the veins through which the lifeblood of commerce, local travel, and even wartime logistics flowed. Indeed, the War of 1812 underscored how critical water transport could be. The waterways surrounding New York acted as strategic channels, sometimes for military purposes, and sometimes for moving goods with a speed and flexibility impossible by land. Cornelius soon gained a reputation for reliability, not to mention a near-fearless attitude toward competition. Where others saw a risky venture, an unpredictable ocean, unpredictable economics, he saw a chance to dominate. Each time he shuttled passengers, you could say he was laying a brick in the foundation of an empire. By his early 20s, he was ready for something bigger. Steamboats were on the rise, a revolutionary technology that promised to blow past the limitations of wind and sails. Think of it like the invention of commercial airplanes in the 20th century, a disruptive leap forward that changed the game for anyone involved in transportation. Vanderbilt's jump into the steamboat industry wasn't a gentle toe in the water. It was more like a cannonball off the high dive. He embraced steam-powered vessels quickly and adeptly, acquiring and managing routes that brought him considerable profit. Historical journals and articles from sources like the Vanderbilt Museum's archives confirm that his fierce competitive streak and sense for business led him to be called Commodore, a nickname that stuck for life. What made Cornelius Vanderbilt truly stand out was his willingness to engage in rate wars, a strategy that's been well documented in both academic and popular histories, including some analyses in Forbes. If a competitor tried to undercut him or present a challenge, he would drop his fares to rock-bottom levels. People flocked to his steamboats, grateful for the cheaper tickets, and rivals often found themselves operating at a loss until they gave up or sold out to him. It's a tactic reminiscent of modern business behemoths. Slash prices to corner the market, drive out rivals, then recoup profits later. According to newspaper stories from that era, Vanderbilt was either lauded as a champion of lower travel costs or denounced as a cutthroat monopolist, depending on which paper you read and who was footing the bill for advertising. In time, the name Vanderbilt became shorthand for wealth, ambition, and an almost ruthless flair for free market competition. There's a certain irony in the fact that ordinary passengers briefly benefited from those low fares. Vanderbilt's rate wars made travel cheaper, which in turn spurred commerce by enabling more movement of goods and people throughout New York's waters. Some historians from local New York blogs and the Smithsonian Institution's records have noted that this sort of competition actually contributed to a growing consumer base. Small farmers, merchants, and everyday travelers found it more viable to transport their produce or commute to better-paying jobs. The result was a cyclical surge in regional prosperity. Yet for all the benefits, the underlying motive was straightforward. Vanderbilt wanted to be the last man standing, and he had no qualms about brandishing cutthroat tactics to achieve that. As the decades rolled on, Vanderbilt's empire in maritime transport continued expanding. But even that wasn't enough to satisfy his appetite for business dominance. By the time the 1860s rolled around, the landscape of American commerce was shifting. Railroads began to replace steamboats as the next major frontier of growth. The Civil War, which ended in 1865, had shown just how vital rail lines could be for moving troops and supplies quickly across the country. This period of reconstruction and industrialization magnified the importance of efficient transportation. And so, in one of the shrewdest moves of his entire career, Cornelius sold off much of his shipping empire to invest heavily in railroads. If you lived in that era, you could almost feel the hum of excitement and maybe dread if you were a competitor when he began pouring his vast capital into tracks, train cars, and railroad stations. He wasn't a young man at this point, already around 70 years old, an age where most of us today would opt to kick back and enjoy our golden years. Instead, he flung himself into railroad consolidation, snapping up lines that stretched across a swath of territory from New York to Chicago. This created something akin to a single integrated system, a feat that historians from institutions like the Smithsonian have said was crucial to the birth of a truly national economy. Think of it this way. Before railroad connectivity, the country felt more like a patchwork of separate regions, each with its own commerce limitations. After the rail networks expanded, it became possible to transport goods from the east to the burgeoning Midwest or even further west in a fraction of the time once required. Vanderbilt recognized that whoever controlled these rail lines controlled the main arteries of America's economic bloodstream. This was visionary, albeit with a splash of old-school opportunism. By consolidating major railroads, including the influential New York Central, Vanderbilt created a transportation network that spurred the growth of industrial and urban centers. Factories in the East could swiftly ship finished goods to new markets, and raw materials from farmland or mining regions in the West could arrive at Eastern ports faster and cheaper. Sources from the era, along with modern economic historians, often highlight that this transformation accelerated America's transition into a heavy industrial power. Some blog commentators say that while other business figures like Jay Gould and Daniel Drew were also engaged in rail deals, often employing cunning tactics of their own, Vanderbilt's imprint was particularly large because of the scope of his ownership and his relentless push to standardize and improve the lines under his control. As you might expect, his personal fortune soared during these years. By the time he passed away in 1877, his wealth was so immense that it's frequently cited as among the greatest fortunes in American history. Estimates vary because converting 19th century dollars into modern equivalents is tricky, but most reputable sources, ranging from retrospective accounts in Forbes to academic analyses of the period, put his net worth at over $100 million in his day. That figure easily translates to at least $2 billion in today's currency, though some accounts claim it could be significantly higher. In practical terms, it meant that Vanderbilt's resources rivaled the GDP of smaller nations at the time, giving him an outsized influence on everything from local politics to broader American policy and social trends. One of the things that makes the Vanderbilt story so engrossing is how it intertwines with the broader shifts in American society. The early to mid-1800s was a time of unprecedented transformation. People were moving from rural farms to new urban hubs. Factories were emerging, fueled by the impetus of the Industrial Revolution. Inventions like the telegraph were changing communication, and new financial institutions were popping up to fund these ambitious endeavors. Steamboats and later railroads were the engines of this metamorphosis, making them irresistibly attractive to shrewd investors. Vanderbilt didn't invent the steamboat or the railroad, but he became a master at leveraging these innovations, ensuring he pocketed the lion's share of the profits. In the final decades of the 19th century, when the American economy was on fire, fortunes were exploding almost overnight, and a handful of families rose to a kind of wealth and influence that still boggles the mind. This was the Gilded Age, a term popularized by Mark Twain in his 1873 novel, The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, and few families embodied the opulence, ambition, and intrigue of that era as dramatically as the Vanderbilts. Picture an America where railroad tracks stretched farther every day, connecting cities and towns like never before, where steel, oil, and finance reigned supreme, and where the ultra-wealthy flaunted their riches in ways that ordinary folks could only dream about. Amid this electrifying atmosphere, the Vanderbilts built not just rail networks and shipping lines, but also a reputation for grand parties, lavish homes, and, as some whispered, a fair amount of secret wheeling and dealing behind the scenes. During the late 19th century, at the pinnacle of their glory, the Vanderbilts were considered the face of Gilded Age extravagance. Their name showed up constantly in the society pages of major newspapers like the New York Times and the New York Herald, publications that breathlessly tracked every colossal mansion they built and every glittering gala they hosted. According to several historical blogs and museum archives, they were masters of showmanship, pushing American architecture and social norms to new extremes. One article from the Preservation Society of Newport County notes, for instance, that the Vanderbilts dominated the coastline of Newport, Rhode Island, with their immense summer cottages. Of course, calling them cottages was tongue-in-cheek. These estates were anything but modest. For proof, look no further than the Breakers, constructed by Cornelius Vanderbilt II in the 1890s. The Breakers stands as one of the most iconic monuments to the family's wealth and ambition, looming on the shore with an almost palatial air. Built on the site of a previous wooden house that had burned down, it was redesigned with fireproof materials, an innovation championed by architect Richard Morris Hunt. According to the Newport Mansion's official website, Hunt took inspiration from the Italian Renaissance style, conjuring up a 70-room marvel overflowing with imported marble, gilded ceilings, ornate woodwork, and enormous windows that commanded uninterrupted views of the Atlantic. It's said that some of the best artisans in Europe contributed to the mansion's interior details, crafting everything from the carved fireplace mantels to the intricate ceilings adorned with gold leaf. Articles compiled by the Preservation Society mention that specialized workers, some traveling directly from Italy, spent months perfecting frescoes and carved panels. All of this splendor reflected a vision to create a summer home that would rival European palaces and proclaim the Vanderbilt status loud and clear. At a time when most Americans relied on kerosene lamps and rudimentary plumbing, guests at the Breakers wandered through rooms lit by electricity, marveling at telephones, central heating, and elaborate plumbing systems that were still ahead of their time. Even the kitchens boasted then uncommon conveniences like large gas ranges and refrigeration technology, a testament to the family's desire to fuse modernity with luxury at every turn. Yet the Breakers was just one feather in the Vanderbilt's cap. Traveling down to Asheville, North Carolina, you'd find an even more sprawling achievement, the Biltmore Estate, built between 1889 and 1895 by George Washington Vanderbilt II, the Commodore's grandson. Like the Breakers, it was designed in close collaboration with Richard Morris Hunt, and it featured extensive landscape work by Frederick Law Olmsted, famed for co-creating New York's Central Park. Today, Biltmore is recognized as America's largest private home, encompassing about 175,000 square feet and boasting around 250 rooms. Sources from the Biltmore Company's archives detail how George Vanderbilt took inspiration from European chateaux, filling the estate with priceless art, antique furniture, and thousands of books, a collection so significant that the library alone holds around 10,000 volumes. From architectural journals to travel guides, scholars emphasize how advanced the estate was with electric lighting, forced air heating systems, and elevators, the latter a rarity in private homes at the time. According to some references, Vanderbilt even installed an indoor swimming pool and a bowling alley, both cutting-edge amusements that would have astonished most visitors. Beyond its formidable architecture, Biltmore's grounds showcased Olmsted's belief in the power of landscaped vistas. The estate's original acreage stretched across thousands of acres, where Olmsted designed formal gardens, parklands, and even managed forests, introducing scientific forestry practices that were largely unheard of in the United States then. A few newspaper articles from the late 1890s called Biltmore a kingdom unto itself, a nod to the estate's self-sufficiency. Farms on the property produced much of the family's food, and a private railroad spur allowed building materials to arrive directly, accelerating construction and reinforcing Vanderbilt's reputation for efficiency and innovation. What's especially intriguing is how both the Breakers and Biltmore came to symbolize the extravagance that defined the Vanderbilts in the public eye. Magazines of the era, such as Harper's Weekly and Town and Country, ran lengthy features about the sumptuous dinners, the costumes worn at lavish balls, and the architectural wonders these estates embodied. Societal observers like Ward McAllister, an arbiter of New York's high society, publicly lauded the Vanderbilts for their tasteful magnificence, while critics sometimes condemned such excess as vulgar or un-American. Yet in an age when robber barons like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and Jay Gould competed for grandiosity, the Vanderbilts consistently stole the spotlight. For many modern-day tourists visiting Newport or Asheville, these grand homes serve as living museums, offering a window into the lifestyles of Gilded Age magnates who channeled their railroad and shipping fortunes into architectural showpieces. The Preservation Society of Newport County oversees a number of Vanderbilt properties, chief among them the Breakers, which welcomes hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. According to the Society's official website, detailed guided tours take guests past original period furniture, intricate marble fireplaces, and gilt ceilings, all intended to illustrate how the Vanderbilts lived at the height of their power. Meanwhile, down in North Carolina, the Biltmore Company, still under the stewardship of George Vanderbilt's descendants, has transformed Biltmore Estate into a sprawling tourist destination. Online reviews on sites like TripAdvisor and detailed write-ups in Travel Plus Leisure praise the estate's blend of old-world grandeur and modern attractions, including winery tours, equestrian activities, and on-site hotels. Stepping inside these mansions feels like entering a time capsule. In rooms left much as they were in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, visitors see original furnishings, imported European antiques, and family portraits that once belonged to the very figures who built America's rail networks and steamship lines. Historians writing for the Smithsonian Magazine note that these personal artifacts, such as Cornelius Vanderbilt II's commissioned artwork or George Vanderbilt's vast book collection, offer rare insight into the cultural ambitions of industrial-era tycoons. Indeed, Biltmore's library alone houses some 10,000 volumes, reflecting George Vanderbilt's renowned passion for collecting first editions and rare manuscripts. Meanwhile, architectural experts from the American Institute of Architects regard these estates as milestones in American design. The Breakers, for instance, stands as a prime example of the late 19th century's embrace of imported Italian Renaissance styles, while Biltmore's chateau-esque silhouette reveals the influence of French aristocratic residences. Travel bloggers from outlets like Atlas Obscura and Culture Trip often point out that each room brims with technological innovations that were cutting edge for the era: indoor plumbing, electric lighting, and advanced heating systems, amenities that highlighted the Vanderbilts' willingness to adopt and fund the latest engineering marvels. Because both the Breakers and Biltmore remain so well preserved, they have become prime research sites for scholars of social history. Articles in the New York Times occasionally feature behind-the-scenes looks at ongoing restoration projects, funded in part by revenue from tours and special events. Curators and preservationists collaborate to restore wall frescoes, refinish wood paneling, and even maintain some of the original fabrics on display. In doing so, they keep alive the story of the Vanderbilt family's meteoric rise, capturing not just the grandeur of Gilded Age architecture, but also the mindset of an era fascinated by technological progress and relentless self-promotion. Of course, behind the glitter lay a fair amount of intrigue, family rivalries, business maneuvers, and whispers of political manipulation that circulated through newspapers of the day. The Vanderbilts, after all, were not just building mansions for their own comfort. They were sending a message that they sat atop the social hierarchy, that their railroads fueled America's industrial growth, and that anyone who doubted their power need only glance at these palatial homes to see the proof. While some commentators decried the extravagance, many others saw it as a symbol of American progress, a reflection of a new world where individuals could accumulate unprecedented fortunes through ingenuity and competition. Biltmore and the Breakers thus became theaters of wealth, hosting gatherings where politicians, foreign dignitaries, and socialites mingled. Letters and diaries housed in local historical societies reveal that guests might arrive at the Breakers by private rail car, dressed in Parisian couture, only to be whisked up to lavish parties illuminated by hundreds of electric bulbs. At Biltmore, dinner parties could include multi-course meals prepared by French-trained chefs and served on fine china, with an after-dinner stroll through gardens meticulously lit by novel electric fixtures, all culminating in lively conversation amid priceless art collections. So, while the Gilded Age was rife with monumental changes, industrial expansion, the rise of labor movements, and an unprecedented gap between the rich and the poor, the Vanderbilts managed to capture the public's imagination like no other. That legacy lingers in every gilded ceiling and marble-laden hallway of these surviving estates, reminding us that once upon a time in a rapidly changing America, a family with enough vision, ambition, and calculated aggression could reshape industries, build architectural wonders, and live in a way that defied ordinary comprehension. Even today, when tourists stand on the grand balconies overlooking the Atlantic at the Breakers or stroll through Biltmore's vast gardens, it's not hard to imagine the marvel and envy these estates must have inspired in their Gilded Age heyday. People like Cornelius Vanderbilt and William Henry Vanderbilt may have dominated headlines with their colossal fortunes, but behind them, and sometimes right beside them, stood figures like Alva Vanderbilt, Consuelo Vanderbilt, and Gloria Vanderbilt, each quietly, or not so quietly, shaping the family's destiny in remarkable ways. Imagine yourself entering an ornate Fifth Avenue mansion in New York City in 1883. The night air crackles with anticipation as horse-drawn carriages line up outside, guests stepping onto the pavement in glittering French-inspired costumes. The electric lighting, still a novelty at the time, flickers dramatically, illuminating a scene so extravagant that it would be reported on for days in the major newspapers. That very ball, which cost over $250,000 back then, amounting to several million in today's currency, was orchestrated by Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt, 1853 to 1933. She was not merely a wealthy socialite, but a master strategist who understood that in New York's upper echelons, image was everything. According to the New York Times archives, her masquerade ball effectively placed the Vanderbilts, once viewed by old New York society as new money, into the rarefied circle of the so-called 400, the highest tier of social prestige. Newspapers like the New York Herald and the New York Tribune couldn't stop writing about the costumes, the lavish decor, and the guest list, teeming with financiers, politicians, and blue-blooded families. In a single stroke, Alva had secured the Vanderbilt name's place in the social register, accomplishing more than any sum of money alone might have done. But let's not assume Alva's ambition stopped at throwing spectacular parties. If you've ever strolled along the Cliff Walk in Newport, Rhode Island, passing by the majestic mansions that hug the coastline, you might have spotted Marble House. Completed in 1892, and designed by the renowned architect Richard Morris Hunt, the same visionary behind the breakers. Marble House was a brilliant testament to Alva's taste and determination. Drawing inspiration from the Petit Trianon at Versailles, she ordered over 500,000 cubic feet of marble to be used in the construction. According to the educational materials provided by Newport Mansions, the estate cost around $11 million at the time, which, by some calculations, could be well over $300 million today. It was initially intended as a summer cottage, though calling it a cottage is about as ironic as calling an ocean liner a rowboat. Ornate gilded interiors? Check. A lavish Chinese tea house sitting on the grounds? Absolutely. Alva wanted every inch of Marble House to reflect her personal aesthetic vision. She was so detail-oriented that, as some architectural blogs note, she even insisted on importing specific furniture styles from Europe to create an atmosphere that felt both grand and intimate. And here's where Alva took an unexpected turn, breaking out of the usual constraints of Gilded Age matrons. After her divorce from William K. Vanderbilt in 1895, she became an outspoken supporter of women's suffrage. She tapped into her sizable fortune to fund rallies and lectures, and according to various historical sources compiled in local Rhode Island archives, she opened Marble House for suffrage events, an unprecedented move at a time when many high society figures regarded political engagement by women as scandalous. Alva's name began appearing in suffragist newsletters that championed her willingness to challenge patriarchal norms. In fact, some historians note that by hosting suffragist meetings under her own roof, Alva gave the movement an extra veneer of respectability, attracting attention from reporters who might otherwise have ignored the cause. Her daughter, Consuelo Vanderbilt, 1877 to 1964, was swept along in her mother's unrelenting push for social ascendancy. If Alva's masked ball was the family's grand entrance into New York high society, Consuelo's marriage to Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, in 1895 was the family's passport to European aristocracy. Alva arranged this marriage with laser-focused precision, merging vast American wealth with British nobility. According to Amanda Mackenzie Stewart's biography, Consuelo and Alva Vanderbilt, the wedding drew international press coverage. The union signaled a new chapter in dollar princess marriages, where heiresses from the United States effectively rescued cash-poor British dukes and earls who needed funds to maintain their sprawling estates. The ceremony was lavish, with crowds lining the streets in London, anxious to catch a glimpse of the American bride who now carried one of Britain's most storied titles. Yet behind the scenes, as Consuelo's own memoirs reveal, the arrangement was heartbreaking. She felt coerced into a marriage that prioritized social strategy over love. Nevertheless, Consuelo embraced her new role over time, earning widespread admiration in British society by championing philanthropic causes, particularly education and healthcare initiatives. She became a beloved fixture at Blenheim Palace, demonstrating that while the arrangement may have begun as a transaction, her personal drive to make a difference was genuine. Fast forward into the 20th century, and you'll find another Vanderbilt woman who wouldn't merely rest on the laurels of inherited wealth, Gloria Laura Vanderbilt, 1924 to 2019. Perhaps best known for her iconic designer jeans launched in the 1970s, she actually lived a life shaped by drama, creativity, and an enduring quest for self-expression. Her childhood was marked by tragedy and scandal. When she was just a toddler, her father, Reginald Vanderbilt, died, leaving her in a custody battle between her mother and her aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. That 1934 trial was splashed across countless newspaper headlines, with the New York Times referring to Gloria as the poor little rich girl. She eventually came under her aunt's care, growing up in a world where the Vanderbilt name still carried weight, but also carried the ghosts of intense family squabbles. Yet Gloria Vanderbilt's adult life showed an extraordinary blend of grit and glamour. She ventured into acting, studied art, and found success as a painter and collagist with shows at respected galleries. Magazines like Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and Vanity Fair featured her frequently, admiring her style as well as her personality. Then came the jeans. By collaborating with the Murjani Group in the late 1970s, Gloria tapped into a seismic shift in the fashion industry. Women's denim was becoming a high fashion statement rather than simply casual wear. Her signature swan logo and her name embroidered on the back pocket turned Gloria Vanderbilt jeans into a nationwide phenomenon, bridging the chasm between haute couture and mass consumerism. As noted in style retrospectives across various fashion blogs and in Vogue itself, her marketing savvy was just as important as the product design. She appeared in TV ads, showing a new kind of confident, independent woman who wasn't just an heiress living off old money. Gloria also wrote several books and memoirs where she candidly discussed her relationships, her evolving sense of self, and the family legacy that trailed behind her like a spotlight she could never quite turn off. In one interview with the New York Times in the mid-1880s, she described how being a Vanderbilt could feel both like a door opener and a burden. Her personal ambitions constantly measured against the legacy of those who came before her. Undeterred, she dove headfirst into multiple marriages, romances, artistic endeavors, and entrepreneurial pursuits, forging a unique identity that reflected aspects of her Gilded Age predecessors. She understood, much like Alva, the potency of public image in a media-saturated environment, and arguably, she was subversive in her own right. Where Alva once used costume balls to break into social circles, Gloria capitalized on the power of television commercials and fashion runways to etch her name into mainstream culture. If you look at these three women, Alva, Consuelo, and Gloria, you see a remarkable through line. The Vanderbilt name wasn't defined only by men who marshaled railroads or steamships, or by men who built colossal fortunes from shipping lines. Instead, it was also shaped in salons, ballrooms, legislative halls, and later on, fashion runways and magazine covers. Alva orchestrated social coups in the Gilded Age, using her wealth to outshine her peers and champion women's rights. Consuelo brought American energy and resources into the rarefied world of British aristocracy, then turned her focus to philanthropy and progressive causes. Gloria drew on that same blend of creativity and fearlessness, forging her own path as a fashion icon, artist, and cultural figure, whose influence rippled through late 20th century America. The Vanderbilt family reached extraordinary heights of wealth and influence, only to become entangled in scandals, lawsuits, and tales of doom that circulated through newspapers, gossip columns, and even modern blogs that still can't resist the allure of this American legend. To understand how a single family could go from controlling vast fortunes to scrambling to preserve what was left, and how a rumored curse supposedly played into that downfall, you have to rewind to the late 19th century and follow the twists and turns all the way into the 20th. This is the darker side of the Vanderbilt saga, a side steeped in controversies, rumored hexes, and the heavy toll of reckless spending. Everyone knows about Cornelius the Commodore Vanderbilt, the family's patriarch, who built an empire out of steamships and railroads. But fewer people realize how bitterly his children and grandchildren fought after he was gone. According to the New York Times' archival coverage of the legal disputes, some articles dating back to the late 1800s, Cornelius wrote a will that allocated a jaw-dropping 95% of his estate, estimated at over $100 million in 19th century money, to his son, William Henry Vanderbilt. By the standards of the day, that made William Henry the single wealthiest private individual in America, an outcome that enraged other siblings who received only small allowances or trusts they couldn't fully control. Their resentment erupted into a series of court battles, with accusations that the Commodore had been unduly influenced or was not in full possession of his faculties in his final years. Newspapers leaped at the chance to cover these showdowns. The New York Herald, for instance, ran detailed accounts of the feuds, highlighting the drama and the sense of familial betrayal. A few tabloids even printed sensational rumors that the Commodore had all but disowned certain children due to their poor business sense or personal failings. Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt, dogged by mental health troubles and debt, became a tragic figure whose plight fed public fascination. One 1880s article in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch described him as the haunted Vanderbilt, suggesting his father had deliberately excluded him from the lion's share of the fortune to protect the family's empire. Mary Vanderbilt, meanwhile, reportedly believed she was entitled to more than the modest inheritance she received, but she maintained a relatively low profile, in contrast to siblings who fought more openly. Those courtroom dramas, however, were just the prelude. Over the following decades, the Vanderbilt name became shorthand for conspicuous consumption and social climbing. Many historians, and indeed numerous Gilded Age blogs that compile references from the New York Times and diaries of prominent social figures, identify Alva Vanderbilt's 1883 masquerade ball as the watershed moment. The reported $3 million price tag, over $80 million in today's dollars, according to some finance bloggers, dazzled even a city used to wealth on display. The Fifth Avenue mansion hosting the ball underwent a breathtaking transformation with themed rooms, sky-high floral arrangements, and diamonds so plentiful that newspaper accounts joked about the risk of tripping on loose gems. Alva's triumph effectively kicked open the doors of New York's old money elite, who had previously viewed the Vanderbilts as brazen newcomers, despite their already immense fortune. Ward McAllister, a society tastemaker, wrote in his notes, parts of which appear in Town and Country retrospectives, that this single event secured the Vanderbilts at the pinnacle of high society, surpassing even the venerable Astors. Alva wasted no time using that newfound acceptance to stage other lavish gatherings, each more opulent than the last. What started as a canny PR move snowballed into an arms race of extravagance. By the end of the 19th century, later generation Vanderbilts were commissioning European architects to build palatial homes, scooping up entire art collections at auctions, and traveling on private yachts that rivaled small cruise ships. Such unrestrained spending gave rise to rumors of a Vanderbilt curse, some cosmic retribution for wealth gained too quickly or flaunted too brazenly. A handful of newspapers from the era, notably the Boston Daily Globe and the Chicago Tribune, published skeptical pieces on whether the family's repeated bouts of tragedy signaled some supernatural jinx. They pointed to the death of Cornelius Vanderbilt II at 55, relatively young for a man of means in that era, and the financial woes of George Washington Vanderbilt II, the visionary behind Biltmore Estate, as evidence. According to notes on Biltmore's official website and references in the National Register of Historic Places, George spent massive sums on expansions, artworks, and Olmsted-designed gardens, only to find himself scrambling to keep up with rising taxes and economic shifts as the 20th century dawned. More than a few editorial writers in the 1920s cited Biltmore's colossal upkeep costs as emblematic of the white elephant problem afflicting America's super-rich. Once you build a castle, you better hope your fortune can cover it indefinitely. Matters worsened when it became clear that the family's unified wealth was splitting among multiple heirs who had different ideas, or no ideas at all, about how to invest wisely. The introduction of income and estate taxes in the early 20th century compounded these challenges. While earlier robber barons like Andrew Carnegie were channeling fortunes into philanthropic foundations, many Vanderbilts were still financing big homes and bigger parties. By the 1920s, business columns noted that not a single Vanderbilt featured among America's wealthiest citizens. Some genealogical records and Forbes retrospectives suggest that by the time you accounted for inflation and population growth, the once towering Vanderbilt fortune had fractured across so many descendants that none possessed the monumental net worth of William Henry's era. All these collapses in fortune lent credence to the notion of a family curse, even if the real culprit, as historians often point out, was simply extravagance and a lack of long-term planning. In an interview with Vanity Fair, a modern Vanderbilt descendant likened the curse to a legend that explains away bad choices, noting that the family's lifestyle far outpaced most attempts to invest or preserve capital. Blogs such as the Gilded Age Society compile anecdotal tales of how certain family members dumped fortunes into ill-advised schemes like overpaying for European heirlooms or underwriting doomed business ventures, only to blame their losses on ill fortune. By the mid-20th century, the stark decline of Vanderbilt wealth became a tabloid fascination. A recurring story is that by 1973, at a reunion at Vanderbilt University, founded by the Commodore's donation in 1873, hardly any of the 120 attending descendants qualified as millionaires. While the exact details of that claim are debated, it's nonetheless a striking symbol of how far the family had fallen from its Gilded Age zenith. Some newspapers of the era described it as the ultimate cautionary tale. A once indomitable empire crumbling under the weight of internal feuds, uncontrolled spending, and shifting economic realities. The rumors of a curse only grew stronger each time a mansion was sold off or an heir's personal troubles spilled into public view. Today, the legacy of these scandals and alleged hexes lingers as part of Vanderbilt lore. Popular historical podcasts and YouTube channels often retell the stories of the will disputes, the over-the-top masquerade balls, and the slow drip of tragedies that fueled the curse narrative. Visiting Biltmore or reading about the lawsuits that erupted after the Commodore's death, you can't help but sense that behind the gilded exteriors lay a family wrestling with the burdens of immense success. Papers from the Library of Congress and personal letters from the Vanderbilt Archive highlight how many of the heirs felt pressured to keep up appearances, driving them to spend lavishly even when circumstances, like the Great Depression, would have dictated otherwise. Ultimately, whether the family's downfall was predestined or simply the result of bad money management, the scandal-ridden path they took remains fascinating. Those who buy into the curse theory point to repeated heartbreaks and humiliations, such as ill-starred marriages or children who squandered inheritances. Skeptics, on the other hand, see a more straightforward moral, that wealth isn't self-sustaining, and that enormous fortunes, especially those governed by conflicting heirs, can vanish without disciplined stewardship. Either way, the Vanderbilts continue to captivate us, both for the grandeur they embodied in the Gilded Age, and for the cautionary dimension of their later misfortunes. The curses, feuds, and lawsuits may be part folklore, but they're also part of the very real narrative of a family that soared higher than almost any other, and discovered that staying at the top can be even harder than getting there. If you've ever heard the name Vanderbilt, you probably imagine grand mansions, glittering galas, and a certain aristocratic air. And you wouldn't be wrong, especially if your reference points are places like the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, or the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina. Extravagant homes that became icons of Gilded Age opulence. But to understand how the family got there, you have to start with Cornelius Vanderbilt, born in 1794, who famously launched his empire by borrowing $100 from his mother to run a ferry service. He had hardly any formal education, but he possessed uncanny business savvy and a relentless work ethic. According to multiple references from the New York Times archives and detailed Wikipedia entries, Cornelius, later nicknamed the Commodore, laid the groundwork for a transportation empire that stretched from the waterways of New York right through America's rapidly expanding railroad system. Yet it wasn't just that he built an empire, it was how he managed it. Early on, Cornelius made efficiency the cornerstone of his strategy. He was ruthless about slashing unnecessary costs and reinvesting his profits back into operations. He consolidated assets step by step, ensuring that each move yielded maximum benefit for his shipping and railway businesses. Historians commonly highlight how Cornelius's steamboat lines turned profitable because he kept overhead low, and how his railroad acquisitions, most famously the New York Central, thrived because he integrated them carefully, cutting out overlaps and negotiating favorable terms. William Henry Vanderbilt, Cornelius's son, inherited not just the massive fortune, but also this discipline-focused approach. There is a famous quote attributed to William Henry: "Any fool can make a fortune. It takes a man of brains to keep one." This line, referenced in various blogs on American dynastic wealth and in books about the Gilded Age, underscores the importance of stewardship and the perils of taking wealth for granted. William Henry exemplified that notion during his lifetime. He expanded his father's railroad network even further, but he also branched out into real estate and securities. With the kind of fortune the Vanderbilts had, diversification became a hedge against unpredictable markets. By the late 19th century, as railroads faced competition from emerging steel industries, real estate and financial instruments offered a buffer. William Henry grasped that to maintain a fortune long term, you had to avoid putting all your eggs in one basket. According to newspaper archives from the 1880s, William Henry was known to encourage a culture of investment discipline among his children. He tried to instill in them the idea that you couldn't just rest on the laurels of the family name and expect the money to manage itself. He remained famously frugal in certain aspects of his life, despite living in a world where lavish displays were often the measure of social standing. If you compare this approach to what the Rothschilds were doing around the same period in Europe, you'll see some parallels. The Rothschilds carefully arranged marriages among different branches of the family to keep the wealth in-house, and they established legal structures like trusts to protect their capital from external claims and internal fragmentation. This is one reason the Rothschild fortune endured across centuries. By contrast, while the Vanderbilts dominated the American landscape for a time, they lacked that same cohesive intergenerational strategy. Sure, William Henry did diversify, but the family never locked itself into a robust framework of trusts, corporate structures, or carefully orchestrated alliances. In Europe, the Rothschilds used their famous Concordia Integritas Industria motto, loosely translated to harmony, integrity, industry, to embody the principles that kept the wealth integrated. The Vanderbilts, despite their success, never quite matched that level of structural unity. Instead, many heirs after William Henry became drawn to the glitter of high society and grand estates, a phenomenon that would ultimately unravel the carefully managed fortune. For a while, though, the disciplined strategies continued to pay dividends. The family reaped enormous benefits from the post-Civil War industrial boom. When the country's infrastructure was being rebuilt and modernized, railroads emerged as the juggernaut of transportation and commerce. Many Gilded Age fortunes, like those of Andrew Carnegie in steel or John D. Rockefeller in oil, depended on partnerships with rail lines for shipping raw materials and finished goods across the nation. That put the Vanderbilts in a position of enormous leverage, controlling key routes from the East Coast toward the Midwest. References in Forbes articles and academic financial studies highlight how integral the Vanderbilts were to shaping the American economic landscape. They set prices for freight and passenger fares, influenced where new lines would be built, and played a part in fueling the rapid industrialization of the late 19th century. Throughout this expansion, William Henry and some of his immediate successors continued to channel profits into diversified portfolios. In many ways, it was the golden era of the Vanderbilt name, when it seemed like nothing could challenge their empire. The Commodore's obsession with efficiency was carried on by William Henry, and together they cemented a family legacy that was both admired and resented by the broader public. The trouble started when later generations, those that came after William Henry, lost sight of the disciplined ethos that had built the empire in the first place. You can see hints of this shift in something as seemingly innocuous as architecture. In earlier years, yes, the Vanderbilts built substantial homes, but these were often overshadowed by the family's focus on business. As the decades progressed, though, the family's name became associated with ever larger mansions. The Breakers in Newport, built by Cornelius Vanderbilt II, is an iconic example of Gilded Age extravagance, sporting 70 rooms, gold-leafed ceilings, and imported marble floors. Then there's the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, constructed by George Washington Vanderbilt II, which still holds the title of America's largest private home at roughly 175,000 square feet. These enormous projects, chronicled extensively in the New York Times and local newspapers in Asheville and Newport, drew wide public attention and admiration, but they also embodied a shift in priorities. Rather than reinvesting the bulk of their money into stable assets or future-focused ventures, the later Vanderbilts poured astronomical sums into real estate developments that were expensive to maintain. As if that weren't enough, the family also became known for hosting extravagant galas and balls that made headlines in newspapers, like the New York Herald. Some historians point to Alva Vanderbilt's 1883 Masquerade Ball, which reportedly cost the equivalent of over $80 million in today's dollars, as the moment the Vanderbilts officially elbowed their way into the top echelon of New York high society. This was a period when society columns were all the rage, providing extensive coverage on who attended which event, what they wore, and how much was spent on decorations. According to diaries and letters from that era, including those preserved by the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Reference Department, Vanderbilt galas could span multiple days, featuring orchestras brought in from Europe, imported champagnes, and themed decor so lavish it made older aristocratic families like the Astors appear conservative by comparison. For a time, such display had its social benefits. It showcased the Vanderbilts as a force to be reckoned with, not just in business but also in society. Yet behind the scenes, All these parties and estates were placing an ever heavier strain on the family's liquid assets. The real crunch came in the early 20th century when the American economic landscape started shifting faster than the Vanderbilts could adapt. According to business historians, several factors converged. The rise of automobiles and improved road systems challenged the dominance of railroads. New forms of communication, like telephony and eventually radio, changed how business deals were struck, and the federal government began to regulate big business more aggressively. Antitrust legislation, higher income taxes, and the gradual introduction of estate taxes all ate into the family's fortune. Some heirs tried to hold on to the railroad assets, but with less centralized leadership than in the Commodore's day, the lines were managed in a patchwork fashion. Some branches of the family decided to cash out and sell their railroad stakes, often at less than ideal times or prices, to finance personal expenditures. Others pivoted to entirely different ventures or married into families with different financial priorities. Without a unified approach, the fortune inevitably began to splinter. As the 20th century progressed, more heirs faced the reality that their once unassailable family fortune was no longer sufficient to support the lifestyles they'd grown up expecting. Newspapers started publishing stories in the 1920s about Vanderbilt's selling off assets, ranging from paintings and furnishings to entire properties, just to pay debts or to maintain other estates. Economists of the time and some editorial columns used the Vanderbilts as an example of how quickly fortunes could dissolve if not managed carefully. The railroads, once the lifeblood of commerce, were increasingly overshadowed by the automobile. Henry Ford's Model T and the advent of paved highways revolutionized transport. Demand for passenger rail travel began a gradual but significant decline, which in turn impacted the profitability of rail shares the Vanderbilt heirs were holding. Then came the Great Depression of the 1930s, which decimated many old fortunes. While some entrepreneurial families managed to pivot, the dispersed Vanderbilt clan found it harder to regroup and strategize collectively. How do you go from commanding one of the greatest fortunes in history to barely registering on the scale of new money billionaires like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk? Historians often point to the combination of lavish spending and insufficient reinvestment. The Gilded Age ethos emphasized grand public displays, which the Vanderbilts performed with gusto, from building opulent homes to hosting million-dollar parties. It wasn't just about showing off, it was about cementing their social dominance in a rapidly changing America. At the time, building a 70-room cottage in Newport or a colossal estate like Biltmore was a statement that nobody else could match their resources. But these structures, magnificent as they were, required ongoing expenditures for staff, upkeep, property taxes, and endless rounds of renovations. Without the same disciplined reinvestment strategy Cornelius and William Henry had, the capital couldn't replenish as quickly as it was being spent. Take Biltmore Estate, for instance, the project of George Washington Vanderbilt II. It remains a national treasure and a magnet for tourists wanting to glimpse the pinnacle of Gilded Age splendor. But it's also emblematic of the family's shift from hardcore business efficiency to aesthetic pursuits. George Vanderbilt reportedly poured endless resources into the estate, hiring the best architects and landscapers like Richard Morris Hunt for the house and Frederick Law Olmsted for the grounds, to create a European-inspired chateau in the hills of North Carolina. Historical records, including those kept by the Biltmore Company and local Asheville archives, show that the estate quickly became an economic pillar for the region, employing hundreds of people. yet it was never as profitable as the railroads. Over the years, parts of the surrounding land had to be sold off, and eventually a significant portion of Biltmore was open to the public just to cover maintenance costs. While it now operates as a successful tourist site, it's no longer strictly a Vanderbilt family home, in the same sense it once was. This isn't necessarily a tragedy. Biltmore is still gorgeous, and it's better preserved than many other Gilded Age mansions. But it does underscore that the unstoppable fortune of the Commodore's era became, by necessity, a different kind of enterprise. Meanwhile, the great Vanderbilt rail empire also fell prey to technological and economic shifts. Once the heartbeat of American commerce, rail lines faced stiff competition from trucking companies, highways, and air travel. As rail's dominance waned, so too did the returns on Vanderbilt-owned stock. Some heirs sold off these assets when the market wasn't particularly favorable, using the funds to finance personal endeavors or, in some cases, to support expansions to their estates. Over time, fewer and fewer family members were directly involved in running railroad operations, meaning the family empire had no central steward to adapt to the changing transportation landscape. Blogs focusing on corporate history, as well as older news articles analyzing the Vanderbilt downfall, consistently mentioned that no single Vanderbilt stepped up to orchestrate a transition into burgeoning fields like automotive manufacturing or aviation. By contrast, families like the Rockefellers pivoted from Standard Oil into broader realms of finance and diversified holdings, ensuring their name remained strong in the corporate world. So, when Anderson Cooper casually drops the news that there's nothing left of the inheritance, he's referring to this entire historical unraveling. That might sound dramatic, but it aligns with what historians call the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves phenomenon, where wealth amassed in one generation rarely persists beyond the third. The Commodore starts it in the early 19th century. William Henry expands it, and a few of the immediate heirs keep it going for a while, but eventually it splinters. The difference here is that we're talking about one of the largest fortunes ever seen in modern times, which makes its disappearance all the more spectacular. Still, for those who dig into the details, it becomes a natural outcome of not having an overarching family strategy to preserve wealth amid a rapidly changing economy. That's not to say the family name has vanished from public life. You'll see it in places like Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, which remains one of the country's most prestigious institutions, often ranking in the top 20 national universities. In fact, U.S. News and World Report, a reputable source for college rankings, placed Vanderbilt at number 13 in the nation in recent years. The Commodore's $1 million donation in 1873 laid the school's foundation, and it has flourished into a major research university. The Vanderbilt name adorns buildings, endowments, and programs on campus, serving as a lasting homage to Cornelius's philanthropic impulse. Throughout the 20th century, the university's growth far exceeded anything its founder might have envisioned, though ironically, few Vanderbilt descendants are closely tied to the running of the university today. Other place names keep the family legacy in the public eye, at least superficially. Stroll through Manhattan and you'll find Vanderbilt Avenue running alongside Grand Central Terminal, once built and controlled by the New York Central Railroad. Various cultural institutions, from museums to historical societies, have plaques and wings bearing the Vanderbilt name, funded at least partially by philanthropic gifts from the family in earlier eras. And if you're a tourist exploring the East Coast, you can drop by Newport, Rhode Island to see the Breakers, or head down to North Carolina for the Biltmore Estate, both operating largely as preservation sites. The Preservation Society of Newport County, for example, manages the Breakers, among other cottages, offering guided tours that highlight not just the architectural grandeur, but also the social context of the Gilded Age, a period as rife with labor exploitation and wealth inequality as it was with glittering soirees. Still, the modern Vanderbilts rarely show up in lists of the world's richest clans. By 2014, the New York Times and other major newspapers were citing Anderson Cooper's statements that the family trust money had effectively dried up. In interviews, Cooper joked about how he had to pay his way through life like everyone else, making it clear that he received no head start from his famous ancestry. There was talk about a small sum his mother, Gloria Vanderbilt, might have left him upon her passing in 2019, but nothing approaching the staggering sums people associate with a name that once dominated rail and shipping. It's a far cry from the days when the Vanderbilts were rumored to hold the lion's share of America's private wealth.